Well, it was after while listening to the previous paper, which I found very interesting, and I had occasion to think of the several earthquakes I have experienced in my life. One in the town I grew up in, Vancouver, which is in an earthquake zone. Another in Toronto, which is not in an earthquake zone at all. And the third one was one which a number of people in this room shared with me, and that was the Enhigio meeting in Japan in 2011. And in the middle of that meeting, in the middle of the night, everything started shaking. It was great. Okay, so the subject of my paper, and let me say, it's a great pleasure, of course, to be here in Les Aisies. And it's such a wonderful place and such a place of singular importance in archaeology and paleontology. And so it really is wonderful to be here. The subject of my paper is perhaps an unusual one for Enhigio. Georg Christoph Lichtenberg was neither a paleontologist nor a geoscientist, leaving aside the work he did in geodesy. He was appointed as a professor at the University of Göttingen at the age of 28, and he taught subjects in mathematics and the physical sciences. And he made his reputation, above all, in experimental physics. And some claim he is the first person to have held a chair in experimental physics, but this is a matter of, I suppose, some definition and quibbling. He did what might count as experimental natural philosophy. He's remembered in the history of the physical sciences for his discovery of Lichtenberg figures, which are branching electrical discharges created by static electrical charges. And he was able to copy these figures onto paper. And hence Chester Carlson, who patented the xerographic copying process in the mid-20th century, credited Lichtenberg with coming up with a basic principle. But nowadays, people see this as these Lichtenberg figures as examples of fractals. Now, in his life, Lichtenberg was very popular as a lecturer, for his wit was brilliant and incisive. And let me tell you a little bit about him. And here is a lovely sculpture of him by the Albanian sculptor Fuat Dushku, and it is in the center of Göttingen. And he was born in 1742 in the small village of Oberramstadt, which is near Darmstadt in Western Germany. And he lived his adult life in Göttingen, where he studied and where he taught. And I show you here a picture of Göttingen as he saw it in 1785. Now, this is a likeness of a drawing made by Horst Janssen, who was a very distinguished graphic artist. And he had a real connection with Lichtenberg. And so he did this drawing and he called it So sah es. This is how he saw it, as Göttingen as he saw it in 1785. This is a likeness, perhaps a forgery is the right word, that a friend of mine made for me in Göttingen. And it's really rather a remarkable likeness of the original. I show it to you because if you look at the hill behind Göttingen, you will see it is bare of trees. This is not a coincidental matter, and I'll come back to this later on. Now, Lichtenberg wrote widely in writings that in publications that were meant not for a university audience, but for a more general audience. For example, here is the Göttingen Magazine for Science and Literature, which he co-edited with Georg Forster from 1780 to 1785. And then he's also very well known for his Göttingen Pocket Calendar. This was an annual publication that came out once a year from 1777 to 1799. He's listed as the editor. He was, in fact, the author of almost everything in it. And the essay, and that I'm going to be speaking about today, among other things, is from the 1795 volume of the Göttingen Pocket Calendar. And after he died in the 19th century, Lichtenberg became more widely known for his extensive explanations on Hogarth's etchings. And these became very widely published in the 19th century. And this is the first edition of this, and it was printed serially, and this is the first one, came out in 1794, and this is one of the famous Hogarth prints. It's strolling actresses dressing in a barn, which Hogarth made in 1737, and which Lichtenberg commented on at great length in 1794. And he commented on, a great number of Hogarth's prints. And Lichtenberg, I should point out, was quite an Anglophile, and he spent two important periods of his life in London, and I will get back to that. And here again is another thing that he did. So I'm trying to give you some sense of the various things he worked on. And one of the things for which he became very well known was for his editions of textbooks. These are not textbooks that he wrote himself. They were textbooks that he expanded and elaborated on. And so this is Johann Christian Polycarp Erxleben's Foundations of Natural Philosophy. And this is the fourth edition, the first one that came out with Lichtenberg's editions. So Lichtenberg added quite a bit to it, came out in 1787, and then the next edition came out in 1795. The sixth edition, it had extensive editions by Lichtenberg. And I should point out, Erxleben wrote very widely, and Lichtenberg did quite a bit of work on these. And Erxleben, in fact, was an important source for Goethe's knowledge of chemistry. And so I'm thinking of the elective affinities and his textbook on Erxleben's textbook on chemistry. I'm thinking of Philippe Taquet's paper. This was an important source for Goethe's knowledge of chemistry. And so Lichtenberg, made money by coming up with these editions. And here is the full picture of him. Now, Lichtenberg was known, as I said, in his lifetime for those textbooks, for his teaching. In the 19th century, he became more widely known because of his commentaries on Hogarth. But in the 20th century, actually it was in the late 19th, but in the 20th century, other parts of his work came to the broader public. And these are his so-called waste books or scrap books, things he never published. They're called, in German, they're called as Sudelbücher, which is a book that is a word that really doesn't have a translation, and it might be like a scrapbook or a waste book. That's how it's usually translated. And these are series of aphorisms, and there's hundreds of them. And they became very influential for a great number of people, ranging from Freud to Wittgenstein to all sorts of people, were taken up by these. He's got a great following in literary studies, specifically for these work in the waste books, the scrap books. And so he's become, very well known, in some ways more widely known now than he ever was in his lifetime. And so here's, for example, a very brilliant literary critic, Clive James, who's writing about Lichtenberg and lessons on how to write. And finally, he says, finally, I'm quoting James, finally, it is his detailed and unflinching awareness that astonishes the reader. Scattered through his scores of waste books and manuscript notebooks, Lichtenberg's innumerable observations, nutshells each add up to a single demonstration of his guiding principle, that there is such a thing as the right distance, a sense of proportion. He is the thinker against hysteria, the mind whose good-humored determination to avoid throwing a tantrum provides us with a persuasive argument that the tantrum might be the motive power of political insanity. His clarity and concision set a standard for expository prose at whatever length in the whole of his language, and by extension in all languages. And so here is Lichtenberg himself speaking about proportion, and I'll try and translate this as I go. The error of many modern writers as well as artists consists in exaggeration. A well-ordered sense of moderation that does not have any sense of greed is a true pleasure. And as soon as one goes to the limits, to the borders, and starts asking the question, why not just go further? There is a kind of exaggeration in which everything is permitted, and which is why so many soft heads like it so much. And so he has this, this is the kind of Lichtenbergian sense. And so in 1774, he went to London for the second time for a 16-month stay. The first time he went was in 1770. He was a tutor to a couple of wealthy aristocratic students from England in Göttingen. And they said, come to London. He went to London with them. And as he wrote back to his publisher, Dieterich, he said, at times I'm living like a lord here, and at times like, a wandering apprentice. This is somebody who carries all his possessions in a cloth bag. And he really was having those kinds of contrasts. He literally got to know the king. And at other times, he was really living very simply. But in 1774, he stayed for 16 months. He got to know a great number of people, Joseph Banks among them, James Watt, the Forster brothers, or the Forster father and son, and he really connected with a lot of people, including Joseph Priestley. So he really got connected to a lot of people, and he was, as I say, very much an Anglophile. And as he came back to Göttingen, and he continues with his teaching, in the pocket calendar, he writes an essay on some reflections on the physical revolutions of our Earth. And I will quote to you a passage from it. And this is on the physical revolutions of our Earth. The subject itself is of such grandeur and sublimity that even the unaffected discussion of it is capable of drawing every thinking person to reverential astonishment. Even that isn't all. When treated with knowledge and a tamed imagination, it offers an inexhaustible source of mental exercise and entertainment. The growing hope of penetrating deeper into the history of the Earth's crust than is possible through human artifacts offers no small attraction. Even as we are daily deciphering new signs by which that history is indelibly written, it is still worth the trouble to test our small steps in ABC against that difficult text, that is the world, and to see how closer we have gotten to the essential meaning. And so he's really, really quite captivated, and he sees some large sense in this. And here is one of his aphorisms from Notebook J. They were just ordered according to letters of the alphabet. And he says, we see in nature not only words, but always just the starting letters of words. And when we try to read them, we find these so-called words are just starting letters of other words. And I have a sense, though I cannot demonstrate it, that he must have been thinking of Galileo when Galileo was saying the universe is written in the symbols of geometry. Lichtenberg didn't have this sense of Galileo that you can just figure that you're capable of deciphering all of it and figuring it all out. There's a more limited sense, a sense of humility in what he's doing, and it makes it attractive. Now, in his reflections on the revolutions of the Earth, he's of course writing this because of what's happening in France, because he's writing it at the height of the terror. And he says this, and he laments this. He is a moderate monarchist. Of course, he's living in Hanover, which is under the personal union with England, because they have the electorate of Hanover is King George III, so they have the same ruler. And so he is a moderate monarchist, but he laments very much what is happening in France. This is also a country to which, a place to which he has a very deep attraction. And he specifically says in his reflections on the revolution of the earth that he says, the study of nature, he says, and I'll quote to you, all study of nature, when it is done for the dignity of our intellect and not for boasting or for vain material gain, leads insensibly to great moral purpose. So he really sees a kind of moral purpose in the study of nature. And so then he says, look, he gives us a promissory, he gives his readers a promissory note. This is 1794. He said, I am going to tell you something about revolutions of the earth, but it's going to come in another volume of the pocket calendar. Now, I should say, Lichtenberg had a very conflicted relationship with writing. There were times when he wrote very quickly and fluently, and there were times when he wrote nothing at all that were just blackness for him, when he'd get writer's block. And 2 months later, he'd write in his diary, wrote not a word for 2 months. And it was, and it's really horrible for him. And I should point out something about Lichtenberg, which is relevant. He was physically disabled. He had a hunchback, which left him short, small, and it also made breathing very difficult for him. And by all accounts, he was a hypochondriac. I mean, he was ill often, but he really thought he had everything. And so he struggled with these things. And yet he had a great, he wrote very sensitively about, even about physical love and these kinds of things. And so he really, he has a sense for embodiment, you might say. So he has this struggle with writing, and the pocket calendar was something that he sometimes wrote with very great haste. Indeed, he says there's at one point while he's writing, and his publisher, who's his great friend, Georg Christoph Lichtenberg, who lives in Göttingen, and he's writing for Lichtenberg, and he's writing the pocket calendar, and he's sending the pages, and Lichtenberg is having them printed up, and he's sending the page proofs back, and the ink is still wet. And Lichtenberg says, my whole room smells like ink. There's wet ink everywhere, and he's doing these corrections and sending them back. So he's writing with great haste on some of these. I don't know if this was one of the ones that he was writing so quickly. So here is another aphorism, and I'm going to leave this with you while I tell you about his geological fantasies. And this is classic Lichtenberg. Der Amerikaner, der den Columbus zuerst entdeckte, machte eine böse Entdeckung. So this is long before, this is centuries before post-colonialism, and Lichtenberg gets it, right? I mean, he gets it. The American who first discovered Columbus made a terrible discovery, and he just stands these things on their head, and it's a really pithy way of getting you to think about things in a completely different way. And I think this is very relevant here, because in 1795, he writes a brilliant and witty essay called Geological Fantasies, Franklin's Geogeny. And he says, well, last year I promised, that is in the previous issue of the pocket calendar, I promised you an essay on revolutions of the earth. And I said then that there were 48 different theories of the earth. By now I know there's 50. And then he begins to speak about William Whiston's theory of the earth. And he has some fun with it, and with Woodward, and with the sacred theories of the earth of the late 17th century that they represented. And he says, it is remarkable to see, and I quote this in my abstract, it is remarkable to see what goes on in this kind of writing. And I will It is unbelievable what revolutions of the earth have done for revolutions of the mind. Just as one finds sea creatures on mountain peaks in the former, without a trace of sea far and wide, so one finds in the latter, that is theories of the earth, with astonishment, conclusions without trace of a sure premise, so far as the eye can see. And he says, look, he says, so we have Whiston, who has a temporary suspension of the laws of nature in order to make his system work. And Lichtenberg writes, I suspect there is a temporary suspension of the rules of reasoning in his writings. And he goes on like this, and he has great fun with it. And then he says, well, he says, and I mean, I could quote pages of it, don't have time for that. But he says, look, and then he steps back and he says, you know what? There is a place for this kind of geological fantasizing. And he says, I'm going to go to someone who has done it in, I think, a very useful way. And that's Benjamin Franklin, another person he admired very greatly. And I wondered, by the way, in Madalena's paper of that pantheon of images, if Benjamin Franklin wasn't one of the people who was in it. You might want to check, because I thought he was a likely one for that guy on the far left. I really thought that was very possible. And given his close relationships with France. And so Lichtenberg looked at Franklin as an example of bon sens, of good sense. He really thought this was a kind of writer he admired. And so what is Franklin proposing? Well, Franklin proposes it, and Lichtenberg says, I'm not going to summarize. I'm just, I'm telling you about it from memory, even though he lives across the street from the greatest collection of 18th century scientific writings in the world, right, in the Göttingen Library. Everything is there. He gives the source where he read it, an English publication called the European Magazine. And he says, look, this comes from Franklin's letters to the Abbé Soulavie, who was a geological thinker in the 18th century. And so he gives you the source, and then he starts telling you about it. He says, I'm not going to bother looking it up. You can read it yourself. I'm going to give you my gloss on it. Well, what does Franklin propose? He proposes that you think about the earth as a fluid, and think about just as the atmosphere can be thought of as a fluid, what if we think of the earth as having a crust that's floating on a fluid? And what if this fluid be air? And you think, air? Yeah, Lichtenberg had taken leave of your senses. And then he quotes Edmé Mariotte, a French chemist and thinker, and he says, look, Mariotte has written about the compression of air and what happens if you compress it further and further. And if you compress it far enough, you can get things to float. You can get rocks to float on it. And he says, according to Mariotte, if you only went down 100 kilometers, gold would float on compressed air. It'd be so dense. And his point is, he said, look, imagine thinking about the earth, the crust of the earth, as floating on a fluid. And he said, this gives you a different way of thinking about geological phenomena, and including things like earthquakes, right? And so he's proposing these things. He says, look, this is play of the mind. This is not scientific writing of the sort that Erxleben is doing, and the sort even that he had done himself. But it's useful for thinking about the natural world. And you have to do this in a kind of limited way. Just remember, this is reasoned play, you might say. It's reasoned play. And so he lays all of this out. He suggests experimental evidence. He suggests ways in which it can be generalized and other conclusions that might be drawn from it. He compares it to things in Newton's queries. He compares it to Lucretius, right, who's one of the great heroes of 18th century free thinkers and coming up with a sort of materialist account of things. And so he draws out all of these things, and he says, there you go, and I'm going to tell you more about this in subsequent editions of the pocket calendar, which, alas, he never did. But I want to conclude by pointing out three things. I mean, Lichtenberg was anything if not careful about his use of language. There's nobody you can find that uses language more carefully. And what does he use? He calls this essay Geological Fantasies, and he calls it Franklin's Geogeny. And he knew very well that the most current word at the time in the German language was geognosy, right, which was a description of the earth. And geogeny is a much more unusual word, and geology was pretty unusual in 1795 as well. And he knows that those top two terms are associated with speculation, and he knows even that they're often ridiculed by people that he admires and that he mentions, like Luc, for example, or Saussure. And he compares, look, he says, you know, this kind of fantasizing might be a way of bringing together the observations of those guys, he said, like Luc and Saussure, who wander on top of mountains, and others like Werner and Charpentier, who wander around inside of mountains, right? You know, getting these two different things together. And he said, this might be a way to pull all these things together. And so he knows that he's really leaning over to the side of speculation. But as I say, it is a kind of reasoned and limited speculation. And I think that it's a very interesting thing to consider because in his first essay on revolutions of the earth, he says, look, humans have changed the surface of the earth through the use of the axe, the shovel, and the plow. And it's quite clear that he's read Buffon's Epochs of Nature and that he's thinking of the seventh epoch, the age of humans, right, in which humans change nature. And Lichtenberg's got a limited sense of this. He said, look, we can't change nature very much. We can't change it very much. But and woe if we could. He said, because we do not have our moral, woe to us if our moral capacity, if we had the power to change the earth as volcanoes and earthquakes do, because we don't have the moral capacity for dealing with such power. And so it really is an opportunity. I mean, you think, wow, in an era where people really like to talk about the Anthropocene, you can see that Lichtenberg is raising these basic moral questions and how they connect. He could not foresee the way humans change the environment. By the way, if you think back to this, if I go back to this lovely picture of Janssen, that hill behind Göttingen, as some of you know, has for over a century been very densely forested. In the 18th century, Germany probably had less forest than it does now because so much of it was used for charcoal. But of course, the environment is being changed in other ways very dramatically in that part of the world and others. So there's a lot to think about there, and I will leave you with that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ernst Hamm, on focusing on a figure who is very conscious about language and very conscious about speculation. And we have now this topic in our room, which is very, very nice to have it on the end of, of this session too. So I think there will be a lot of questions. I think I see Claudine. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. And speaking about language, there's a word that you underlined, which is revolutions of the world, which of course can refer to Copernicus to some extent, but is also, I mean, predates Cuvier's use of the term when he writes his discourse on the revolution of the surface of the globe. So, and this, I didn't know exactly the date of this use.
1794 is when Lichtenberg wrote the essay, Reflections on Revolutions of the Earth, and he compares it to the French Revolution.
This is very interesting. Perhaps it's the first use of the word revolution in the Cuvierian sense.
I do not know. I will say that Lichtenberg, one of the books he did write was he wrote a biography of Copernicus. So he certainly knew about Copernicus, and he certainly knew about Copernicus's uses of the revolutions. So he had a longer sense of that, no doubt.
But it's also the sense not only of the revolutions of the planets, but also of the revolutions that the Earth underwent.
Yes, exactly.
So
exactly.
This is a different sense.
Exactly, and he quite explicitly connects it to political revolutions, and he says that's where this comes from. It's from what's happening at France that makes me think of this.
It's very interesting.
Yes.
Link.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ernie. It was a beautiful presentation. I found very intriguing the source of these scrapbooks and these notebooks published by Lichtenberg. What a wonderful source they must be. And I wonder if in that writings or in other parts of his production, his publication, but in particular in those writings, he had given space to the concept of fieldwork, because you were geological fieldwork, because what you were mentioning at the end of your talk, I consider very important for understanding also this feeling of the difference between theoretical approach and empirical approach.
Yes, I mean, the answer is yes, and he does. And so he mentions it briefly in that essay when he says, look, there's two types, those that go on mountains like Saussure and De Luc, and those that go inside of mountains, and that means those studying caves, mines, the subterranean world, that is Werner, Charpentier, Trebra, and others. And he did know that literature, because if you look at Erxleben's his additions to Erxleben, he's citing all these people in his additions and the things he adds. He gives reference to people doing descriptive field work of various kinds. So that is something that he is aware of.
Thank you very much, and a wonderful talk. I know Göttingen very well, and it's lovely to see this early scene. I'm interested in whether Lichtenberg had anything to say about what we now call scenarios, i.e. the speculations about how the world looked in the past that were beginning to happen in the 18th century. People were beginning to make speculative ideas about the fossils that were around them, or the scenes that happened in previous Earth revolutions.
I think this is a very, thank you, Sue. I think that's a really good question. And I don't know if he was thinking about them as scenarios, but as I said, he's in a place that has got a fantastic library, a library that he used a lot. And the Göttingen Library was famous. When Coleridge went there in the early 19th century, he said, there was no place he'd ever been to that had so many scientific works. So the big books like Hamilton on Vesuvius, they've got a magnificent edition of that. And so he's seeing things like that. He's also, because he refers to it, so I assume he's looked at it. And he refers to other kinds of work where people are depicting fossils. As of reconstructions of the previous world, that I don't know. I just don't know if he had thought about that. No, he was a professor of natural philosophy or experimental physics. Yeah. Sure. I mean, look, Blumenberg and Lichtenberg were friends. And so, you know, and he certainly knew about mammoths. And I guess it's a question of what counts as a scenario. And I'm thinking of a larger scale depiction of an environment. And that I don't know about, but he certainly knew about what Blumenbach was doing, was very interested in it. And I think would clearly have been very sympathetic to those kinds of reconstructions. And it's interesting because, when you look at what he says about the moral purposes of doing natural history, natural philosophy, you might think that he's a kind of natural theologian, because it does sound like natural theology. But the problem is Lichtenberg, as he says in one of his aphorisms, I thank dear God that he has made me an atheist. And this is again Lichtenberg. Lichtenberg, he turns things around, and sometimes I think his atheism, might have been like Spinoza's, that it had a great deal of devotion in it and a strong moral sense, and even a sense of a God, but an impersonal one. And so so he's not concerned about ruffling feathers, let's put it that way.
Thank you so much for your
there's one
talk.
more
It's
question.
very inspiring.
Oh.
Johann.
Thank you so much, Ernie, for your enriching but also entertaining talk. I have not a question, because Ezio also asked this question about fieldwork, which is very, very interesting for me also, because I see, this it's a sort of technique of Lichtenberg. He used, to criticize theories without being in the field. So it's really a tool to speak about, or to evaluate, to revise concepts. I think that's very, and I see also the figure of Lichtenberg in this transition between reasoning about the earth without being in the field, but at the same time, fieldwork became much, much more important. And I also think, for example, on Kant, who wrote a lot in his lectures on physical geography. He wrote a lot about caves, but he never has been in a cave, as we know. So, and it became afterwards very, very much criticized about his concepts. And I think that's very interesting for me. Lichtenberg maybe used it also as a tool.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I was going to say at one point in this talk, in an earlier version of it, that Lichtenberg never really did any field work, but this is wrong, because he did geodesic work, which is not geology, but it is a kind of field work. But I think we should stop there. Everyone is really tired.
No. We should not stop with announcement, but I also want to ask you, if you can work with somebody is inside and somebody is outside, and he's an inside scholar, a polymath in Göttingen, the richest place in that time on one side, and then he gets always outside with his thinking, and he travels, but he stays in Göttingen. So I think he's a candidate for cultural studies, for early cultural studies, because if you read the books now to cultural studies, they say Nietzsche is one of our founders. Yeah? But I would put Lichtenberg as one founder, because cultural studies, because he moves around, and his associations, and he deconstruct. It's a sort of deconstruction what he does. Would you?
I'd be in favor of having more study of Lichtenberg by anyone. And I think that, look, Lichtenberg, part of the thing that makes Lichtenberg so interesting to me is when he's writing and the place he's writing at, because he's writing just at this crucial time where the modern scientific disciplines are beginning to take shape, and the older world of natural philosophy and natural history, as these overarching categories, are being changed, and he's a part of that transition.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So
Just